Okay, sign-in sheet, I believe I sent that around, right? Somebody have that? Yeah, okay. When you get done, just pass it forward. Today we're going to talk about nationalism and what happens. We didn't talk a lot about Napoleon in this class, but the French Revolution we did talk about some, and Napoleon. But that's going to shake everything up in Europe. And we're going to have a lot of upheaval, have a lot of people dying, actually. A lot of riots, a lot of wars, a lot of rebellions. And so once we get to the end of Napoleon, Napoleon fights, he builds a big empire, but eventually that empire crumbles. When that empire crumbles, now Europe is left with a situation. What do we do? What do we do with Europe now that Napoleon is gone? And so the leaders of Europe get together, and in fact they begin what they call the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna is a meeting or sets of meetings in the city of Vienna. Basically what they're setting up is what's called the Concert of Europe. This is not a musical concert, but this is the idea that things could be, what do we want to say, done in harmony, done together in concert with certain goals and rules. And it works pretty well because it keeps the peace, by and large, in Europe for about 100 years, until World War I. What are the principles of the Congress of Vienna? One of the number one principles is legitimacy. Legitimacy. The Congress of Vienna wanted to have legitimate rulers. Legitimate rulers. When Napoleon came in and took over all of Western Europe, really, and when the French Revolution happened in France, what happened to the king? Anybody know what happened to the king of France during the French Revolution? Yeah, he met up with an invention by Dr. Guillotine. Dr. Guillotine had developed a more humane way to execute people, and that was by dropping a very heavy blade that's angled in a track. So you pull it up with pulleys with a rope, you let it go, boom, and it would slice the heads off. Now, that was more humane because in the past they'd done that with a guy with an axe. And sometimes he had to chop a couple of times. So this way it was done more neatly, I guess you might say, more quickly, more efficiently. But that's what happened to the king. The king was executed. His head was sliced off by the guillotine. So now that Napoleon is gone, guess what? We can't bring the king back and make him king of France again. Why? Well, he's not around. So they decide they want to get legitimate rulers. They have to go to the closest relative of the king and restore the monarchy that way. So this is what they're looking to do. How do we bring back rulers that will be legitimate? Say in France, we have to look for a relative of the king and make him king. Also, restitution. France, under Napoleon, had taken over basically all of Europe, certainly all of Western Europe. They had imposed a lot of laws and taxes and so forth. So the idea here is that France is going to have to make payments. That's what we mean by restitution. Make payments. It's like when you're playing baseball and you knock your baseball through the neighbor's window. You might go over and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, can I have my baseball back?" But the neighbor might also want more than an apology. Might want you to also pay to get his window fixed, right? That's what I mean by restitution. And so they wanted France to do that, and of course, to restore or give back the lands that they had taken over. So this is what the Congress of Vienna was about. And the third part was stability. They wanted things to be stable so that this kind of revolution would not happen again. Things have been in upheaval in Europe for 30 years or so. Thousands of people had died. Lots of property had been destroyed. So anyway, here we go. Here is Europe in 1815 with the Treaty of Vienna. Notice that this territory, a lot of this territory to the right of France, had all been under the control of France. Basically, from France all the way over to that green part, which is the Russian Empire, France had controlled. And remember, of course, the French had invaded Russia. That had not gone well for them. But all those lands there in the middle, all the parts that would be parts of Germany, Poland, Austria, the Netherlands, and so forth, Denmark, all of these had to be set up now with new and fledgling nations. In France, the previous king was gone. So what are we going to have? A new king. This is a relative of the previous king, and he takes the next number up. He's Louis the 18th of France. Now take a look at his painting here. What does Louis the 18th look like? I mean, if you compared his painting to Louis the 17th's painting, you would see a big, big difference. What's he look like here? Like what? George Washington. Yeah, a little bit. Well, yeah, I mean, he's pretty old, but he, well, notice he's sitting behind a desk. He's got books there and pens and things. In other words, he's doing work. Most of the kings before this whose portraits would never have been behind a desk. They would have been standing in very fancy clothes and just sort of gazing off, because they didn't really do that kind of work. He's showing, hey, I'm an administrator, I'm a boss, I'm running things, I'm getting things done. Also, look at his clothes. What do his clothes look like? Yeah.
Military?
Yeah, military. Excuse me. Exactly. He looks like a general or something like that, right? He's got the medals and he's got the buttons down his pants there, along the seam. He's got the lavalettes or whatever they're called on his shoulders. He's trying to look like a military guy, maybe a general, an admiral, something like that. Much in the style, of course, that Napoleon had been a military leader who had ruled France, very different than the previous kings. He's trying to show that, hey, he is concerned with the military, he's getting work done. He's not like the old king, even though he's the relative of the old king. But this is a new kind of king. Now, he's also going to reorganize things in his government. He's going to set up two chambers to advise him, to be involved in governing, a chamber of peers and a chamber of deputies. The chamber of peers would be appointed by the king. Sort of like in England, they have the House of Lords. And the chamber of deputies, again, like the House of Commons. In this case, elected by the people and representative of 100,000 people. So for every 100,000 people, there would be a deputy. I mean, it's also a little bit, we imitate it here in the United States, right? We have a Senate and we have a House of Representatives. The Senate is very, very limited, right? There's 100 senators, but there's, 378? 5? I don't know. in the House of Representatives. All right. And by the way, where they're from shifts as, after like we got the 2020 census, we will lose certain congressional districts and we will add other ones in other states because that number stays fixed. So if people move out of Ohio and move to Florida, they'll take out a congressional district in Ohio and they'll add one in Florida or wherever the people are moving. Anyway, this is a new approach. Now, the next king after him is Charles X. Charles X now is getting a little bit away from, there's been a little transition since the French Revolution. Louis XVIII had been, fairly agreeable with people. But Charles is going to start flexing his muscle and say, you know what, we've gone a little too far. We need to get back more of the monarchy. It's not going to go so well for him. But he starts to restrict the middle class. He starts to try to make changes to the Constitution that would give the king more power again. And because of that, a revolution breaks out in France. They do not want to return to the king or the way the king operated prior to the French Revolution. So that becomes clear. They feel he's overstepping, and that's what they do. Well, in fact, even though the Congress of Vienna is trying to keep everything stable, there is a lot of underlying tension. This tension has to do with, the way things are operating. For example, the French Revolution, you kind of got rid of the king, right? You got rid of a lot of the trappings of the monarch and the trappings of the nobility. And now, a lot of the common people, peasants, let's say, wanted to have more say in the government, but that's not coming. They thought it would come. Like, say, democracy or something like that. They'd be able to vote for things more and have that sort of thing. That's not happening. But basically, they're trying to go back and sort of restore what was there before the French Revolution, modified a little bit, but it's not going far enough for a lot of people. That's really, in large measure, explains why we have a series of revolts in 1848. In fact, in the first 4 months of 1848, there are 50 revolts in Europe, across Europe. Most of them are wanting democracy or something like democracy and national self-rule. That's why I'm starting to talk about nationalism. In the 19th century, we see a growing nationalism. What is nationalism? Anybody know? Yeah.
From a very, very foggy remembering of the description, it was like being so proud of your country despite its own, or being proud of your country despite its own faults.
Okay. It's definitely pride in it's seeing yourself as part of a nation and pride in that nation, wanting to promote that nation. Yes. And we sort of take for granted, or we have taken for granted in the past anyway, in the United States that we were one nation under God, indivisible, right? I've read that somewhere. And so we kind of equate, people who live in the United States, are citizens of the United States, they are part of the nation of the United States. In Europe, it gets a little more confused because you have different groups of people who are wanting to have their own nation, and they don't have a nation. So, for example, you have the Basque people who live in the mountains of Spain, kind of up to the mountains of France, in southern France. They want to have their own country. They haven't had I don't know if they've ever had their own country, really, but that's what they would like. So they identify themselves as a sort of a nation of people that doesn't have a country. And we see that in other places. Like the Kurds in the Middle East. You've heard of the Kurds, I suppose, in Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Syria. There are Kurds that are there. They would like to have a country, probably call it Kurdistan or something like that. But there is no Kurdistan. I don't think there ever has been a Kurdistan. But these Kurdish people are divided up by different nations, borders of Turkey, Syria, and so forth. And they don't want to recognize those borders. Right? Of course, the countries there do. This has been a big problem if you're listening and watching things in the Middle East, for example. So we see that kind of thing. They would like to have their own nation. That's what I mean by nationalism, is not only, I suppose, supporting your nation, but having a nation, identifying yourself with a group of people as a nation. Well, anyway, and so that's what's happening in Europe. You've got people here who don't have borders. They don't have their own government, yet they feel they should. And others who do have it, who feel they ought to extend their influence over other areas. Why? Because we're the best. Naturally, we should share our greatness with others. Anyway, at first these revolts, at the beginning, had some success, but in the long run, they kind of fall apart. Now, one of the things that will happen, though, as a part of this sort of upheaval, is we will see that the king is booted out of France, and that we have this guy pictured here, whose name is Louis Napoleon, will come to power. Now, this Louis Napoleon, of course, is not Napoleon Bonaparte, but he is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. But overall, most of these uprisings are not very successful. Part of the reason is they're not very well organized, because it's mainly sort of a grassroots kind of thing. People just are upset and they begin to protest and other people join in. It's not really well organized with, what is our goal? What are we trying to get? How are we going to do it? We just kind of protest, okay? So protesting doesn't always get the results you want, right? Especially if you're not organized well. Now, a lot of this stuff that we're seeing in Europe, nationalism and the problems of Europe, we're going to see them coming over here to what I'm going to call the New World, to South America, to the Caribbean, to parts of Central and North America, especially where the Spanish and the Portuguese have been involved. Now over here, we have a situation whereby, for example, let's say, Spanish have come to dominate lots of areas, right? That's not news to you. The Spanish have come to control Mexico and, lots of other countries in South America. When they come, of course, there's already people here, right? So what happens then is you get different kinds of people living in these areas. For example, first of all, you have the people who you might say are the native people, the people who were here before the Spanish, let's say, showed up. But then you have people of Spanish descent who were born, not born in Spain, but born in, let's say, Mexico or some other place like that. And so they don't see themselves, even though people might identify them with the Spanish, they don't see themselves as being the same as the Spanish of Spain. Okay? So this is a problem. And then you've got the people who are from Spain who come over to these areas for a short amount of time. You guys doing all right back there? Something's wrong with your PC? All right. Well, I hope you get it fixed. So these are called peninsulars. Peninsulars are the people that live on the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, if you know what that is. That is basically Spain and Portugal. So those people who come over, let's say people from Spain or Portugal might come over, let's say like to Mexico, but they don't intend on staying. They're just coming over to sort of advance their career. They'll come over and be a leader, they'll be a governor or something like that. After they're over here maybe 6 years, 10 years, then they're going to go back to Spain. So they're from Spain, they're going back to Spain. They're only temporarily here, okay? Temporarily here. They're temporary residents. But there are those of Spanish descent, that is, their mothers and fathers, let's say, were born in Spain, but they were born in Mexico. They were born here, and they don't intend on ever living in Spain, even though their parents may think that'd be a good idea for them. They want them to still be Spanish, or have the culture of Spain. And a lot of times they will send them to school back in Spain or Portugal so that they can learn what it's like to be Spanish. But it's going to be those people who are going to lead the rebellion, eventually, the rebellion of the people to gain independence. And those people are called Creoles. Creoles. The Creoles then are people of, say, Spanish or Portuguese descent who were born in the New World and who intend on living there their whole lives. They think, they begin to realize that they're different than the people of Spain. I suppose you can have a similar kind of thing here in the United States, right? Early on, you'd have the colonists, some who just came over from England, and some who tend to go back like governors and things. But then you have those who are born here and tend to live here their whole lives. They begin to say, yeah, I'm a British citizen, I guess, but I don't feel like I'm the same as the British. All right, so it's a similar kind of thing. Well, anyway, once these Creoles, sons and daughters of born here are sent back home. A lot of times they were to get their education. Send them back to the University of Madrid or something. They get back there and they begin to realize they're not the same as their peers, their classmates. And they begin to learn about how other places have independence and how other places the teachings of the Enlightenment and the example really of what happened in the United States, in America, where we rebelled against the Europeans and we actually got independence. This becomes a kind of model or inspiration or whatever you want to call it, that, hey, maybe we can do the same thing. We don't have to stay under the thumb of the Spanish. Added to that also is the fact that the Spanish and the Portuguese are in a lot of trouble, especially when the French come in and take over Spain and Portugal, and now the French become the rulers instead of the Spanish. All that kind of gets weakened then. Well, anyway, what this means then is we're going to have rebellions. We're going to have rebellions across the New World because Napoleon will actually defeat Spain and Portugal. And so all of those colonial territories which Spain and Portugal controlled are weakened. They're weakened. And so what we see then at the beginning of the 19th century, let's say the first quarter of the 19th century, is a whole series of revolts, uprisings, revolutions, if you will, in the New World, in Latin America. And many of these countries gain their independence during this time. Okay? From Mexico, Central, South America, and several places in the Caribbean, the several islands, and so forth. All right, so that's going to be a big change. It's a big change from having the colonial power of Spain and Portugal to being independent countries that have really relatively weak economies and almost no military, or not much of a military. So here's our buddy Napoleon. So let's just take a look at an example of a few of these independence movements that we have. The first independent state, and this is interesting, is Haiti. You might think it would be, somewhere else. No, it's Haiti, the island of Haiti. It happens in 1804 with a giant revolt by about 100,000 slaves who come and overthrow. They had been brought under French control, and so they revolt against Napoleon and his troops. So that's the very first independent state in the Caribbean or Latin America area. Another early one is about 6 years later, and that's Mexico. Mexico in 1810 gains its independence under the leadership of this man here, Iturbey, and he is a Creole, like we've been talking about. His parents were from Spain. He was born in Mexico. He was, they tried to sort of raise him up like he was Spanish, but he identified as being something different than the people back in Spain. He was Mexican. He was not Spanish, at least not in the cultural sense. So he will then lead a revolt in Mexico. Now, notice that the people who are leading the revolts are not the impoverished masses, in most of these cases. They are the people who are wealthy. They are the people who have a lot to gain, that if we kick the Spanish out, I'll be in charge, you see. So you can call it a revolution, but it's not the kind of revolution that a lot of people talk about as being some kind of rising up of the peasants. Now, across then South America, we see a whole host of uprisings. Jose de San Martin in Argentina, again in 1810. Simon Bolivar in Venezuela. And in fact, Martin and Bolivar worked together to try to push the Spanish out of South America. And they pretty much have that done by 1824, because they go and they help people in Peru, Uruguay, Colombia, Venezuela, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. All of these areas are liberated, I guess they would say, are gain independence during this same period, and they can trace back a lot of it to Bolivar, San Martin, their guidance, their encouragement, their working together to make this happen. Now, what that means then, of course, independence, more freedom, but of course it also means that you have all across South America new countries. All of them are about this, just newly formed. All of them have economies that had been based a lot on being a colony of Spain, and so now they have to rework their economy. Like I said, they don't have much of a military. Banking systems, laws, constitutions, everything has to begin. So that will make them vulnerable and sometimes unstable. And unfortunately, still in South America, things are often unstable. But that's maybe a discussion for another day. Anyway, this is how it gets started. So here is a map showing mostly South America. Some of Central America is inset here. And you see the actual dates of their independence. What's that say? Mexico, 1821. Colombia, 38. Brazil, 1822. Uruguay, 1828. Argentina, 1810. So basically from about 1810 to about 1830, 35, over about a 25, 30-year period, these nations are all liberated mostly from Spain and also from Portugal. You still have a few holdouts in the north part up here, Guyanas. You got the British, the Dutch, and the French Guyana still there. And there is still a British area here called Mosquito Coast. There's a place you want to vacation. Mosquito Coast is a British area. And of course there's a British Honduras as well. But by and large, most of these areas are now independent. Once that's the case, a lot of the Europeans, other Europeans, like especially the British, and somewhat maybe the Germans and others, begin to eye this territory, especially the British. Hey, push the Spanish out, we should move in. After all, we're pretty good at empire building. And Britain wanted new markets. So anyway, the British have interest there. They're maybe not as interested in taking over the land directly, but they wanted to control the markets. The United States, still a fledgling nation here in the 1820s. We've been around now for maybe 40, going on 50 years. And so the president named Monroe, perhaps you've heard of him. There's a little political cartoon here. I don't know if you can make it out. But this is supposed to illustrate the Monroe Doctrine, if you can make out what's there. You kind of see an Uncle Sam figure. He's the big guy in the center. There's Uncle Sam. He's holding like a baton of a guy in a parade, right? The marshal of the parade. And then over to his left, you can see a globe. The globe is turned to the hemisphere of the Americas. And it's on a pedestal. And then over here to the right, it's kind of hard to make it out, but there are some Europeans, definitely probably some Prussians and maybe some British, and others. And basically this is to illustrate the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. This Monroe Doctrine basically stated that no European nation was to extend their territories in the New World, in this hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere. What does that mean? Well, the British have a couple of pieces of territory. The French have Guyana, right? The Dutch have Guyana. But basically it's a message saying, look, don't try to expand anywhere else. Anybody new, don't come in here. Germans or somebody thinking about it, don't even think about Prussians coming in here. Why? The U.S. is saying, basically, this is our hemisphere. There are fledgling nations here in the Americas, and they're sort of saying, look, if you mess with them, you're going to mess with us. So there's different ways you can look at it. You can say, oh, well, the U.S. is trying to take over all these lands for themselves. Well, maybe some, at least more control. But it's also an idea of stability and keeping the Europeans further away from America. All right? Basically, if you start to move in, start to be provocative, the United States will use military force against you. So this is a message primarily being sent to the Europeans. So this begins the U.S. Involvement, I guess, in this part of the world, which has continued, you know, and on and off and in different ways for the last 200 years. So that's the Monroe Doctrine. This is sort of our hemisphere. Well, let's move back now to Europe, shall we? Okay, thanks. I want to take a look at two nations, two areas which have not been unified. So we're going to look at Italy and we're going to look at Germany. At least that's my plan over the next several minutes. The Ottoman Empire is collapsing. The Ottoman Empire is in trouble. The Ottoman Empire had a lot of land, though. It had the Balkan states. It had the area around the Black Sea. It had Turkey, Middle East, Egypt, North Africa, all the way over to Afghanistan, all the way over to Algeria, and all the areas in between. So it's a lot of territory, and Europeans are really hungry looking at that. They'd like to have some of that, right? That's dessert, and they are hungry for dessert. They want they want a piece of that cake. And they even call, the Ottoman Empire is often called in the 19th century, the sick old man of Europe. He's got all this land, but he's getting old, he's going to die, and we don't really want to wait for him to die before we start getting his stuff, which unfortunately begins to happen to people as they get older. Well, Austria and Russia want territory. They begin to seize territory from the Ottomans, especially in the Balkan states. And we'll get back to that, if not today, later. But also we have in this area Italy. When you think of Italy, you know, you think of that whole boot that sticks down in the Mediterranean, that's Italy. But Italy was not united like that as one country. Not until about 1870, 1871. And Germany, likewise, you might think of it as a united country. It was fragmented into scores of principalities until 1870. Okay? And it's going to be those two nations then, those two countries, which actually create a lot of trouble in the 20th century. In part, I guess I would say, because what they're trying to do is make up for lost time. They're playing catch up. They didn't get the colonies like the other ones got, and so forth. Well, anyway, all of these things are weakening this stability of Europe, the concert of Europe, because people are wanting the territory of the Ottomans, and because a fragmented Italy and a fragmented Germany is, people like France like that. If Germany's fragmented and is not unified, that's great for France. And Italy the same way. Well, how's it going to happen? It's going to happen under the leadership of this guy. And he's got an impressive facial hair, I'm just saying. Look at those. Look at those pointy mustache, pointy goatee. That's Victor Emmanuel II, who is the king of Piedmont. And I'll show you where Piedmont is in the northern part of what we'd call Italy today. Reigns from 1849 to 1878. Well, he is going to appoint this man, Count Cavour, as his prime minister. Piedmont was in the north. It was more industrialized than almost any of the other part of Italy, and therefore it was wealthier. But what happens is they want to try to unify Italy under Piedmont. Part of what they do is they actually stir up trouble in other parts of Italy so that basically the people say, hey, come and help us. So keep that in mind. Sometimes when people are coming to help you, get you out of trouble, they might have actually been the people who caused you the trouble just so they could have the excuse to come help you, right? Kind of sneaky, but I guess effective. Especially if you're running out of your chai double espresso lattes, and somebody says, "Here, let me help you with that." While revolts in the southern part of Italy, Cavour sends in one of his guys named Garibaldi. Garibaldi actually sort of starts a militia. He starts a kind of almost like a gang, I guess you'd say, because they're wearing all the same color shirts. They're called the red shirts.
Say the same about Britain.
What's that?
Could have said the same about Britain and certainly the Revolutionary War.
The Revolutionary War. Yes. Well, the red coat, you mean? Yeah. Well, these guys aren't really, the red shirts aren't really military. They are not military, but they are sort of military. I mean, they're paramilitary. They're more like an armed gang, but they've been sent to stir up trouble. In part, they stir up trouble and they send these guys in and say, hey, they'll help you with the trouble. But, then it's just a way to sort of take over. So you got to be careful when somebody says they want to come help you. They may have ulterior motives. That's all I'm saying. They may not always really just want to help you. In fact, they may have caused some of your problems in order to have the excuse. Well, Victor Emmanuel, this whole thing will eventually work, and by 1861, he is now crowned King of Italy. There's still some pieces they don't have, primarily from the Pope, the Papal States. But they begin to take over parts of the Papal States. They finally take over Rome in 1870. And so this then unifies Italy under one king, King Victor Emmanuel, in 1870. It does leave behind, however, one small piece, which is Vatican City. Vatican City is its own principality, but that's just a small remnant of the old Papal States. Okay? So, unity of Italy by 1870. So here you see a map. Look up in the north, this sort of tan area here. That's the Piedmont. That's what was more unified. Then here's Rome. This is the last piece that's added, part of the Papal States. But actually, by this time, by 1870, it controls all of Italy, from the Alps all the way down, including Sicily. This all comes under the territory now of Italy, including Sardinia and Sicily. All right, in a somewhat similar, although not identical way, Germany is also fragmented. By the way, during the time of the Reformation, during the time of Martin Luther, for example, let's say the 1520s, 1530s, Germany was divided into over 300 principalities, territories, with 300 princes and rulers. Very fragmented, okay? And this, everyone recognized this as a problem because during the reign of Napoleon, he had consolidated some of it. He had a thing called the Confederation of the Rhine, which had kind of sort of started a kind of unification, but that didn't last after Napoleon's time. So basically there's a lot of discussion that if the German-speaking people were to ever be powerful or, be a force to be reckoned with in any way, they'd have to be unified. The question was, how are they going to be unified? The assembly, sort of liberal, political group had tried to do it. They failed. So the other two possibilities were the two most powerful German-speaking territories was Austria and Prussia. Austria in the south, Roman Catholic. In the north, Protestants, Prussians. Well, spoiler alert, it will be the Prussians who win out. All right? We're skipping ahead in our story. But by 1862, King Wilhelm I of Prussia wants a larger army. He goes to the assembly. The assembly turns him down and says, look, you don't need it. He gets really upset with this. You could call him the king. You could call him Kaiser. There's his picture. And he has some of the most impressive facial hair that we're going to see today. If you could get your facial hair to that level by the end of the semester, come and see me. We'll have to work something out. I don't know what it's going to be, but it's got to be real, and it's got to be that size there. Now, like sometimes I'll say this, and some of the ladies will say, look, that's not fair. The facial hair, we can't grow the facial hair. To which I respond, you have not met the ladies I have. That's just a joke. That's a joke. You've never seen the bearded lady? Well, anyway, here's going to be the guy who's going to orchestrate it for Kaiser Wilhelm, or who will eventually be Kaiser Wilhelm, Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck is a Prussian, of course. And so when the legislature refuses to increase the military spending, well, that's when Otto von Bismarck is appointed prime minister. Bismarck promises the king, I will see to it that Germany is unified, and I will unify Germany with iron and with blood. Blut. Well, what does he mean? He's willing for people to die for this to happen. And he's going to use force for this to happen. So Bismarck is an interesting guy to study. He has definite goals and he has a definite plan. And I think you got to give him credit. He accomplishes his plan. Okay? Well, how's he going to do that? Well, we got a few minutes to try to look at that. One of the things, of course, he has to deal with, these are the people that may not want to see Germany unified. Austria, especially under Prussia. Austria, Russia, and France. Notice that Germany is right in between those three. Having a weak Germany, they like that. France does not want a strong Germany. Russia does not want a strong Germany. Austria does not want a strong Germany under Prussian rule, perhaps under themselves. But what is Bismarck going to use? It's interesting. He's going to use both warfare and diplomacy. Pretty shrewd, I think, in the way he does this. And he changes his tactics. He doesn't just stick to one approach. He's got a very definite plan. He's going to use warfare first and then diplomacy after. All right, let's take a look at it. Basically, Bismarck will kind of orchestrate three wars. Three wars, but these are going to be small wars. These are going to be limited wars, okay? The first one is with the perennial powerhouse Denmark. You don't hear about too many wars with Denmark, especially after the Vikings sort of decline. They don't have much of a military. So here's a good idea, by the way. If you want to fight a war, make sure you can win. I think this would be one of Bismarck's first pieces of advice. Pick a war, pick an adversary you can beat. Right? I mean, it works in life too, right? I mean, if you're on the playground, do you want to go up to the guy you think is going to pound you on the ground? Or you want to go pick a fight with a guy you think you can beat? Well, if you want to win, you might want to pick a guy you think you can beat. And so he had a purpose. His purpose was to try to bring the German-speaking people together under Prussian control. And so this is how he did it. He's going to go Denmark, going to fight against Austria, and then finally France. Now, by the way, wars can unify people. That may seem counterintuitive to some, but it is true. A war can unify people. How? Why? Well, first of all, you've got to build a rationale for this war. People have to see the purpose of the war. If they don't see the purpose of it, they won't. But if they see the purpose of it, people will get behind it. Secondly, you've got to make this war limited, especially in the amount of time it's going to be. This war should only last a short amount of time, 6 months, a year. Don't go much further than that. If it starts to drag on year after year, you're going to lose support and you will lose unification. And thirdly, you got to win the war if you want it to unify people. Those are the three things, right? Build a need, build a rationale, limit the time, and make sure you win. This will unify people. The most unified I ever saw people in the United States was right after 9/11. People were unified. It was amazing. Now, we're certainly not that way anymore. 20 years later, 19 years later, whatever, we are more divided maybe than ever. But a war, a common enemy, can unify you. It really can. All right. So let's take a look at our enemy. Denmark, 1863. Now, what's the target here? Again, he also has limited things. Bismarck does not want to go in and take over Denmark, Austria, and France and incorporate it into German territory. That's not his goal. He's using the war for a very specific purpose. This purpose is to go after two territories, Holstein and Schleswig. Holstein, like the cows, right? You heard of Holstein cows, cattle? Well, you haven't? Well, they're good milk cows. Anyway, that area, Holstein and Schleswig, the people there spoke German. But they were being controlled by the Danes, by Denmark. And so this was the rationale. The people, these German-speaking people, want to be liberated from Danish control, and they want to be a part of German-speaking world. So we go after Denmark. And with this kind of talk that, well, here's German-speaking people that need to be liberated, he even brought the Austrians in on Germany's side. Pretty shrewd. And guess what? Denmark loses very, very quickly. The territories of Schleswig and Holstein are liberated. Anyway, they're no longer under the control of Denmark. And so now look what we've done. We've freed these poor German-speaking people who are being oppressed by those Danes, and we brought them back into the fold. Mission accomplished. Next, of course, he targets the Austrians. Why the Austrians? They speak German. Some are reluctant to fight them. This is in 1865 because they both speak German. However, Bismarck knew this was the strongest, these were the two strongest German-speaking regions. One of them is going to have to initiate its superiority in order to unite German-speaking people. And he was pretty well convinced that Prussia could. Prussia marches into Austria. It marches into Vienna. It crushes the Austrian forces in 7 weeks. This is called the 7 Weeks' War. So you have a definite enemy. And here's it. You know, the Prussians did not go over and take over the rest of Denmark. They got those two territories that are German-speaking, and that was it. They march into Austria. What territory did they take? None. After they had the surrender, they just marched out and they left Austria there. They just wanted to show that the Prussians were tougher than the Austrians. And if you're going to follow anybody, if you want to be unified under somebody, you should be unified under us. Okay? All right, that's the 7 Weeks' War. Now here's an interesting part of this is, of course, the French. Bismarck had made he had an agreement with the Russians, a non-aggression pact. And so the only other country that was somewhat of a threat was France. So the French are afraid, by the way, quite frankly, because the Prussians are getting quite militarized. They're having these victories. They're obviously looking for more territory. They're probably going to attack us. So the French were afraid. They were fearful of the Prussians, probably with good reason. And about this time, Wilhelm, or William's cousin, was offered the throne of Spain, because remember, they're royalty, they're Habsburgs. The French get really nervous then, because they would have Wilhelm in Germany, Prussia in Germany, and they have his cousin down in Spain, and I figure, man, we're going to be surrounded, and they're going to come and take us over. And so basically, his cousin refuses this, but this sets up the possibility that something like this could happen. So the French sort of demanded that Wilhelm say that none of his relatives would take over Spain. So Wilhelm writes a telegram. This was cutting edge technology back then. He sends a telegram. It'll get there very quickly. He writes it out, gets ready to be sent. When Wilhelm sends it, before it is actually sent, Bismarck intercepts the message, alters it a little bit. He edits it to make it sound more threatening. Basically what Wilhelm had said, look, I cannot control what all my relatives do. So to ask me to guarantee this, I can't guarantee it. Bismarck made it sound far more threatening. Like, I can't guarantee that's not going to happen. Matter of fact, it might happen. That's kind of thing. This is just what the French did not want to hear. And guess what? The French declare war on them. Bismarck didn't have to have Prussia declare war on France. France declared war on them. It's sort of a preemptive strike. We're going to take them out now. And so, of course, that's exactly what Bismarck wanted. They sent the troops in. They easily defeated the French. They march in. They march all the way into Paris. They march to the Palace of Versailles. They have the French sign surrender at this famous Palace of Versailles. Right? There's a train car there where they make them sign it. By the way, later when the Germans are defeated after World War I, they're going to make the Germans come back to the same train car and sign a surrender to them.
And in World War II, they make them come
And in World War II, yeah. So this Versailles and the train car, I mean, what's happening here is going to sort of set the stage for what's going to be happening into the 20th century. Well, at any rate, at this point, the Germans have won. The French are defeated. But did the Germans take over France? No, they didn't. They didn't take over Paris. They didn't take over France. There was two small territories they took, Alsace and Lorraine. And that's it. So Wilhelm, the king of Prussia, becomes Wilhelm, the Kaiser of Germany. By the way, Kaiser, this word Kaiser, comes from the same root as the word Caesar of the Romans. In these three quick victories, the Prussians returned most of the land to France. Only Alsace and Lorraine, two small territories on the border, which had been disputed for a long time anyway. They were fertile, they were good territories, but that's all they took. Everything else, he turned it right back over to the French. Didn't try to occupy the rest of it. So now Germany is united with the Prussians, through the Prussians. And we see they establish a balance of power through treaties. This is what they're going to do now. Bismarck is going to turn from fighting wars and military action to diplomacy and treaties. And that's going to hold the peace for probably about 40 years after this. So here's a map that shows you the German-speaking territories. Notice there is West Prussia and East Prussia here in the upper right, and you see Prussia here in the center as well. All right, there's Schleswig and Holstein, that green circle. You see it? That's what they took from Denmark. along that peninsula. They defeated Denmark, but that's all that they took, because that's the German-speaking part. Then you see they defeated the French, but this is the only territory they took right here, this small territory on the border, Alsace and Lorraine. They defeated the Austrians, and they took no territory from the Austrians. And so now you see a territory from France and up, all the way up to Russia, and all the way up to the coast. This is all now German-speaking territory, all now unified under Prussian rule. Now the King of Prussia is the Kaiser of Germany. And Austria is the only German-speaking territory outside of their control. All right. Let's say a few other things here about Romanticism. We're talking about nationalism and unification. We got just a couple of screens here before we have to go. Romanticism. You know what Romanticism is? You build a fire. You have some candles. You have some soft music. You invite that certain special someone over. It's very romantic. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Not that kind of romanticism. Romanticism in this case is that you are looking backwards and you are thinking about the good old days. The good old days. You know, for you that would be like the teens. The 20 teens. That would be the good old days for you, like 4 years ago, back when you were in high school or junior high or wherever you were. I don't know where you were. All right. But the good old days where things were great. You know, anyway. So Romanticism then has this industrialization we've been talking about, all the factories that are being built, all the coal dust, all that kind of stuff, all the science and the logic and the classical thinking. And what some people wanted to do is return to the good old days, to a simple life, out on the farm, back in the countryside, where people knew knew what was going on, and where things were built around family and home and nature and good old-fashioned home cooking and that kind of stuff, before you had all this newfangled machinery, right? And big cities and pollution and crime. So it's the idea that we should return to a rural life, an idea that would sort of elevate peasants, farming, even mysticism, because everything was so logical, everything was so scientific. So they begin to look back to the medieval period as the period that they romanticized. Before we had all these machines and logic, and everything is functioning in this sort of mechanical sense. They said, there's some things you cannot explain through science and logic. There are some things that you cannot understand that way. There are some things that are mystical, some things that are unknown. Like Bigfoot. Okay. Hey, those guys are on TV, they're looking for Bigfoot every week.
They almost find him.
Here's an update. Haven't found him yet. But they're going to keep looking. And one day, maybe they'll get him. Well, let me give you some examples of romanticism. I got just a couple screens here left, and we got just a couple minutes left, so I can't belabor it. But let's talk about Johann Wolfgang Goethe. This guy, the tragic. The romantics love tragedy, and mystery. So he wrote a work. This is called The Suffering of Young Werther. Poor Werther. He's like many young men. He loves a young lady, and guess what? She doesn't even know he's alive. She doesn't care. He tries everything to get her attention. She doesn't care. And so young Werther does what any young man in his situation would do. If he can't have you, I don't want nobody, baby. If I can't have you, there's no reason to live. So he commits suicide. He kills himself That'll show her. Also, individualism. They want to rebel against the establishment, the rules, the government, all that kind of thing. Here are other romantic traits. So I want to get all these in. I got one more screen. So if you don't get to write all this down, you'll have to go look because I'll post this later today. But they also go back and take a look at things like fairy tales and peasant stories. This is when they collect Grimm, the brothers Grimm collect the fairy tales. This is when we see neo-Gothic architecture like you see there, the House of Parliament. They begin to build things the way they did in the medieval times. They're attracted to the bizarre and the unusual, like Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's story of the doctor and his monster, and how he's put together with dead parts and he comes to life. And Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, that's sort of an American Gothic stuff. Or The Telltale Heart, you know that one where he keeps hearing the heartbeat because he had killed a guy, put him under the floor. Well, anyway, you got to read that for yourself. Then there's romantic artwork. So let me end with this. Here is pictures of the romantic art. Now let's take a look. Caspar David Friedrich. Notice the focus on nature. You know, one of these things these guys really hated was the locomotive, was the train, because it brought machines into the countryside, belching out their pollution, making noise and clitter-clatter of the tracks. But take a look at this. There are people in here. They're kind of hard to see. Two people right there. See them? Just in the shadows. Here's a guy in a boat right there. But notice you're overwhelmed by nature, and the people are no longer the focus of the art. It's the trees. It's the waterfall. It's the clouds. It's the flowers. Because nature is the beauty, and the focus is no longer on humans, but on nature and the power and the beauty of nature. Well, we got to end there for today. Have a good weekend.